Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the strangest cultural moments in modern history, the 1960s hippie revolution. You know, the era of peace signs, psychedelic vans, flower crowns, and enough incense smoke to fumigate a medieval castle. On the surface, it looked like a groovy rebellion against war, capitalism, and boring haircuts. But underneath the tie-dye and guitar circles was a movement that may have been one of the biggest cultural bait-and-switches America ever pulled on itself. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy the channel, and thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. We're also now live on Spotify, so you can find the link in the description if you'd like to listen there as well. Feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see people tuning in from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable and settle in. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what actually happened when millions of young Americans decided shoes were optional and bathing was a philosophical debate? Did dropping out of society really make you free or just very unemployed? What was daily life like inside those famous communes where everyone promised to share everything, including the dishes, the responsibilities, and unfortunately sometimes the diseases? Why did the peace and love movement somehow involve an astonishing amount of bad drugs, questionable gurus, and people who absolutely did not know how to grow vegetables? And most importantly, if you suddenly woke up inside the 1960s counterculture, would you survive a single day before desperately begging for indoor plumbing and a stable job? Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1967. Your shoes are gone. Someone is playing a 12-minute guitar solo in the corner, and a man named Moonbeam is explaining why money's a government illusion while asking if you can spare $5. Good luck. You wake up on the floor of a crowded San Francisco apartment in 1967, surrounded by sleeping bodies, guitar cases, and the faint smell of patchouli mixed with something that may or may not be burning sage. Outside the window, Haight-Ashbury is already buzzing with young people who believe they're building a brand new society. Peace signs hang from shop windows, strangers hand out flowers, and somewhere nearby a man with a tambourine is singing about universal harmony. For a moment it all feels magical. Then you realise no one in this room appears to have a job. You stretch carefully, trying not to step on the person sleeping next to you, who appears to be wrapped in a blanket decorated with small embroidered mushrooms. The floor beneath you is hardwood, slightly sticky, and possibly the site of several philosophical discussions that got a little too enthusiastic last night. A guitar string twangs somewhere behind you. Someone coughs. Another person, whose name might be Sunshine or possibly Meadow, rolls over and mutters something about cosmic energy before going back to sleep. You sit up and take in the room. There are maybe 12 people here, maybe more. It's difficult to count because some are buried beneath layers of blankets, scarves, and what looks like a very large woven tapestry depicting a smiling sun. The apartment itself is small. One couch, one table, a mountain of pillows that may or may not be furniture. Every available surface is covered in posters, swirling psychedelic colours, peace signs, and slogans about love conquering all things. The place smells like incense, herbal tea, and the faint lingering memory of last night's lentil stew. Outside the open window, the city hums with life. Haight-Ashbury in 1967 is the epicenter of what newspapers are starting to call the Summer of Love. Thousands of young people have arrived here, drawn by music, freedom, and the promise that maybe, just maybe, the world doesn't have to run on 9-to-5 jobs and uncomfortable neckties. You shuffle toward the window and look down at the street, and it is lively. People drift along the sidewalks in colourful clothes, that appear to have been designed by someone who recently stared directly into a kaleidoscope. Long hair flows everywhere. Beads clack softly against denim jackets. Someone is selling handmade bracelets from a blanket spread on the pavement. Another person is offering what he confidently describes as free hugs for the revolution. You notice a small group gathered around a man playing an acoustic guitar. His song has been going on for several minutes now and shows no signs of ending. The audience sways gently, eyes half closed, as if they are collectively trying to hug the concept of peace. It's oddly calming, also slightly confusing. Back inside the apartment, someone finally sits up. He looks at you with the calm seriousness of a man who has recently had a very meaningful thought. "Morning," he says. His hair is shoulder length. His shirt is tie-dyed in colours normally reserved for tropical birds. Around his neck hangs a necklace made of wooden beads the size of marbles. You nod politely. "Morning." He gestures broadly toward the window, the street, the entire swirling scene outside. "Beautiful day to change the world." You nod again, because honestly it does feel a little like something big is happening. In the mid-1960s, the world feels tense and uncertain. The Vietnam War dominates headlines. Young people are questioning everything: politics, culture, authority, even the idea of what a successful life is supposed to look like. And here in this strange little neighborhood of San Francisco, thousands of them have decided to try something different. No rigid rules, no traditional careers, no suits, no ties, and definitely no alarm clocks. Just music, community, and the radical belief that kindness might actually be stronger than conflict. It's idealistic, it's chaotic, and it's about to attract more people than this tiny neighborhood has any idea how to handle. Behind you, someone rustles awake and yawns loudly. Another person begins tuning a guitar. From the kitchen, if you can call a hot plate on a milk crate a kitchen, you hear the sound of a kettle being filled. A voice calls out cheerfully, "Who wants tea?" You turn back toward the window. Down below, the tambourine player is still singing about universal harmony. And for a brief moment, standing there in the soft morning light of 1967 San Francisco, it almost feels possible. Then your stomach growls, which reminds you of something important. If nobody here has a job, breakfast might be a little complicated. Let's talk about fashion. Because if you're going to reject the entire system of capitalism, you might as well look like a walking thrift store while doing it. Your outfit consists of faded jeans, a loose shirt dyed in colours normally seen only in tropical fish, and a necklace made of something that may have once been a curtain. Shoes are optional. Hair is long. Personal grooming is treated less like a necessity and more like an oppressive tool of the establishment. You take a moment to examine your reflection in a slightly cracked mirror leaning against the wall of the apartment. It's a surprising look. Your jeans appear to have lived several lives already. They are faded in places that suggest adventures you cannot remember. The knees are worn soft from sitting cross-legged on floors, grass, and possibly a few festival stages. Your shirt is tie-dyed in swirling patterns of orange, purple, and electric blue. The colours collide with each other in a way that suggests either deep artistic expression or someone accidentally knocked over several buckets of paint. Honestly, it could be either. Around your neck hangs a necklace made of beads, small bits of leather, and what might be a piece of curtain fabric tied carefully into a knot. It jingles softly when you move, which is apparently part of the aesthetic. Because here in the counterculture, clothing is not just clothing, it's a statement. The traditional American wardrobe of pressed suits, neat dresses and polished shoes represents something the hippies are actively rejecting. Those clothes belong to office jobs, strict social rules, and a society that many young people believe has lost its way. So instead, the hippie uniform says something very different. Loose, comfortable, natural, and slightly chaotic, you run a hand through your hair and discover it has grown significantly longer than the hairstyles currently approved by most parents in America. Long hair, for men especially, has become one of the movement's most visible symbols. It quietly announces to the world that you're not interested in looking like your father, or your father's accountant, or anyone who owns more than one necktie. The look continues outside on the streets of Haight-Ashbury. You step out into the morning sunlight and immediately realise that everyone around you appears to be participating in the same grand fashion experiment. Flowing skirts move through the crowd like colourful sails. Fringed jackets sway when people walk. Beaded necklaces bounce against denim vests covered in peace symbols and embroidered flowers, and everywhere there are sandals or bare feet. Bare feet on sidewalks, in parks, and occasionally inside small grocery stores whose owners are quietly questioning how their lives arrived at this exact moment. The style is intentionally relaxed. Part of the philosophy behind the movement is a return to simplicity in nature. Synthetic fabrics and stiff formal wear belong to the corporate world. The hippie wardrobe leans heavily toward cotton, wool, leather, and anything that looks like it might have been handcrafted during a very thoughtful afternoon. Tie-dye, in particular, has become the unofficial uniform of the counterculture. Originally a simple do-it-yourself craft, it turns ordinary shirts into explosions of colour. Each pattern is different, each swirl slightly unpredictable. It's clothing that refuses to be uniform, which of course is the point. Ironically, the look has become so popular that thousands of people now dress almost exactly the same while insisting they are expressing their complete individuality. A man passes you wearing a poncho, 3 necklaces, and round tinted glasses. Another walks by with flowers tucked into his hair and a guitar slung over his shoulder. A young woman sits cross-legged on the curb weaving bracelets while humming quietly to herself. The entire street feels like a parade of colour, texture, and gentle rebellion. And you have to admit it's comfortable. No tight collars, no stiff shoes, no ironing required. Of course, there is one small trade-off. When personal grooming becomes optional and thousands of people gather together in the California sun, the overall atmosphere becomes fragrant. But no one seems to mind. Because here in the summer of love, fashion is not about impressing anyone. It's about feeling free, and maybe, just maybe, looking like a tropical fish while doing it. It's time for breakfast. Unfortunately, breakfast in the hippie world is less about food and more about philosophical discussions involving granola. Someone offers you brown rice cooked in a pot that has clearly been used for at least 12 other mysterious dishes this week. There's herbal tea made from plants nobody can quite identify. And someone keeps insisting the diet is natural, which mostly means it tastes like slightly warm grass. You accept the bowl carefully, because refusing food in a communal kitchen feels like rejecting the entire spiritual journey of the room. The rice is earthy, not in the poetic sense. In the very literal sense that it might have once been closer to the ground than most foods prefer to be. Still, you sit cross-legged on the floor with the others while breakfast unfolds. The kitchen, if we're being generous with the term, consists of a small hot plate balanced on a wooden crate, a dented kettle, and a collection of mismatched bowls that appear to have been rescued from yard sales, thrift stores, and possibly one very confused diner. Someone named River stirs a large pot of oatmeal while humming quietly. Another person is slicing apples with the slow concentration of someone who may or may not still be thinking about last night's discussion on cosmic harmony. The room smells like toasted grains, herbal steam, and the faint lingering scent of incense. Breakfast in the hippie world is rarely rushed. In fact, the idea of rushing anything is slightly suspicious. Instead, the meal unfolds slowly. People talk. They pass around bowls of granola, dried fruit, and something that looks like peanut butter but is introduced as sunflower spread. You take a cautious bite. It is surprisingly good. In the 1960s counterculture, food is part of a larger philosophy. Many hippies believe the modern American diet, heavy with processed foods and industrial farming, is part of what has gone wrong with society. So they turn towards something simpler: whole grains, fresh vegetables, brown rice, which appears at nearly every meal like a loyal friend who never leaves. Some people choose vegetarian diets, believing it aligns better with the movement's values of peace and non-violence. Others simply can't afford meat very often, which conveniently aligns with the same philosophy. A tall man with round glasses sits beside you and gestures toward your bowl. "Food is energy," he says calmly. You nod. Because that feels like a safe response, he continues. If you eat food that grows naturally, your mind stays connected to the earth. You glance down at your rice again, trying to determine how spiritually connected you feel to the earth at this exact moment. Across the room, someone pours tea into a row of mugs. The tea is made from herbs gathered somewhere outside the city. The flavour is difficult to describe. It's slightly minty, slightly bitter, and slightly reminiscent of a walk through a garden after it rains. Everyone drinks it with great seriousness. There is a quiet belief here that food should nourish not just the body, but also the spirit. Of course, there's also a simpler reason the meals look like this. Groceries cost money. And many of the people gathered in Haight-Ashbury in 1967 are not exactly swimming in cash. Simple foods, rice, oats, vegetables, are affordable and easy to share in large groups. Communal meals become part of daily life. Everyone contributes what they can. One person brings fruit, another finds bread. Someone else shows up with a jar of honey that is treated like a rare treasure. You notice that despite the modest ingredients, the atmosphere feels surprisingly warm. People laugh easily. They pass dishes without hesitation. No one worries about who cooked or who washed the pot last night. At least not yet. River finally lifts the oatmeal pot from the hot plate and announces proudly, "Breakfast is ready. Bowls are filled. Steam rises." Outside, the tambourine player is still singing faintly from the street. You take another bite of your rice and sip the herbal tea. And while the meal might not win any culinary awards, it does something else quite well. It brings everyone together, which, in the philosophy of the Summer of Love, might be the most important ingredient of all. Although you do quietly suspect that somewhere in this neighbourhood someone is making toast. Now we arrive at the core idea of the counterculture: dropping out. The belief is simple. Modern society is corrupt, materialistic, and spiritually empty. The solution? Stop participating entirely. Quit school, quit work, leave suburbia, and move somewhere that smells faintly like incense and optimism. In theory, it sounds liberating. In practice, it raises a complicated question. If nobody works, who exactly is paying for lunch? You hear the phrase everywhere in Haight-Ashbury: drop out. It's spoken with a calm confidence, like someone has just revealed the secret level of a video game that most people don't know exists. The idea gained real traction in the mid-1960s, especially after Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary famously encouraged young people to turn on, tune in, drop out. For many listeners, it sounded less like advice and more like a spiritual permission slip. If the system felt broken, simply stop playing the game. So people did. College students left universities halfway through semesters. Office workers walked away from desk jobs that had once seemed respectable. Young couples packed their belongings into cars and drove west toward California, where rumours spread about communities of like-minded people building a new way of life. You step out onto the street and see the results. Thousands of young Americans have arrived here with the same basic plan. Step 1, leave the system. Step 2, figure out the rest later. The atmosphere is full of optimism. People talk about freedom the way explorers once talked about new continents. They imagine communities built on cooperation instead of competition. They imagine lives where creativity matters more than paychecks. Someone nearby explains it to you while sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk. Society wants you to work your whole life just to buy things you don't even need. You nod slowly. He gestures around the street. Out here we're free. There is something appealing about the idea. No alarm clocks, no bosses, no grey office buildings filled with fluorescent lighting and the quiet despair of paperwork. Instead, the days revolve around music, art, long conversations and the pursuit of, and something vaguely described as higher consciousness. But as you spend more time here, a practical detail begins to surface. Freedom is wonderful. Food is also wonderful. And food, unfortunately, has a price tag. Many people survive through a mixture of part-time work, shared resources, and the occasional help from families back home who are quietly confused but still willing to send money. Some sell handmade jewellery on the sidewalks. Others paint murals, play music, or help run small neighbourhood shops that have popped up to support the growing crowd. A few simply rely on communal living arrangements, where everyone contributes something, even if that something is just cooking rice and telling interesting stories. It's less of a structured economic plan and more of a hopeful experiment. Think of it as society's most colourful group project. Sometimes it works beautifully. Other times it resembles a college dorm where nobody remembers whose turn it is to buy groceries. Still, the philosophy behind dropping out runs deeper than convenience. Many young people genuinely believe the system they left behind is tied to larger problems: war, inequality, environmental destruction, and a culture obsessed with material success. Rejecting that system feels like a form of protest, a quiet rebellion. You pass a group sitting in a park debating the meaning of freedom. One argues that real freedom means living without money entirely. Another points out that the grocery store down the street may disagree with that definition. They all laugh, because even here, where the rules are being rewritten, reality occasionally taps on the shoulder. Dropping out doesn't magically solve every problem. But for many people in 1967, it feels like the first honest attempt to ask a different question. What if life could be organised around happiness instead of productivity? It's an enormous experiment, a little messy, a little idealistic, and possibly the only social movement in history where ejecting responsibility somehow requires an impressive amount of philosophical discussion. Still, as you watch the crowd drift through the sunny streets of Haight-Ashbury, one thing becomes clear. For better or worse, thousands of people have decided to try, which is a bold strategy, especially considering that lunch is coming soon. Somewhere along the way, someone suggests that expanding your consciousness might help fix society, and by expanding consciousness, they mean taking psychedelic drugs that make the wallpaper look emotionally supportive. LSD becomes the unofficial mascot of the movement. People claim it reveals deep truths about the universe. Others spend 6 hours staring at their hands, wondering why they have fingers. You first hear about it while sitting in Golden Gate Park. A small group has gathered in the grass. Someone is strumming a guitar softly. Someone else is drawing swirling shapes in a sketchbook that already contains several hundred swirling shapes, and a man with very serious glasses is explaining something profound. The mind, he says slowly, is like a door. Everyone nods thoughtfully. You just need the right key. You glance at the group to see if anyone else is confused. They are not. The idea of psychedelic exploration has become one of the defining features of the counterculture. Throughout the mid-1960s, substances like LSD, first synthesized in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, began circulating among artists, musicians, and curious young people searching for deeper meaning. At first, the experience is described in almost mystical terms. Users talk about colours becoming brighter, music sounding richer, everyday objects suddenly revealing hidden beauty. A tree is no longer just a tree. It is an entire universe of leaves and sunlight. A guitar chord is not simply sound. It is a cosmic vibration connecting all living beings. At least that is the optimistic version. You notice the park is full of people lying on blankets, staring thoughtfully at clouds drifting across the sky. Someone nearby is laughing gently at what appears to be a very philosophical pigeon. Another person is carefully examining their own hands, with the fascination of someone discovering them for the first time. "Look at this," he whispers to a friend. They bend. His friend nods solemnly. "Yes," she says, "they do." For many in the movement, psychedelics are believed to unlock a higher level of awareness. Writers like Aldous Huxley had already explored the idea that certain substances might temporarily remove the brain's mental filters, allowing people to perceive reality in entirely new ways. And the 1960s counterculture is very interested in new ways. The traditional rules of society feel rigid, predictable, a little dull. Psychedelic exploration promises something different, a journey inward, a way to question everything. Of course, not every journey goes smoothly, because while LSD can produce feelings of wonder and unity, it can also produce confusion, or panic, or the sudden conviction that the carpet is breathing. You hear stories about both. One person describes an experience where music felt like waves of colour washing over their mind. Another explains how they spent 4 hours hiding behind a couch because they were convinced the lamp was judging them. The truth is, these experiments are happening faster than anyone fully understands them. Scientists are still studying the effects, governments are growing nervous, and many of the people taking these substances are essentially conducting research on themselves. Sometimes the results are enlightening. Sometimes the results involve trying to explain to a very patient park ranger why you believed a squirrel was delivering spiritual advice. Back in the apartment later that evening, someone lights a candle. Soft music plays from a record player. People sit quietly, talking about the nature of reality. You listen for a while. There's a strange mixture here of curiosity, optimism, and genuine searching. Many people truly believe they are discovering something important about the human mind. Others are simply hoping to feel a little more alive in a world that often feels rigid and uncertain. The psychedelic experiment, like much of the counterculture, is fueled by the belief that society can change if people change first. It is a bold idea, a little risky, and occasionally very confusing. Because if you stare at your hands long enough wondering why you have fingers, you may eventually discover something profound, or you may simply miss dinner, which, as you're beginning to notice, is a recurring challenge in the summer of love. Let's talk about music. Because if the hippie movement had a heartbeat, it was played through electric guitars and massive outdoor concerts. Bands like Jefferson Airplane, The Grateful Dead, and Jimi Hendrix filled parks and ballrooms with sound. Music became more than entertainment. It became a declaration that a new culture had arrived. Also, many of the songs lasted approximately 17 minutes, which was great if you were relaxed, and less great if you needed the bathroom. You hear it long before you see it, a low hum of amplifiers, the warm buzz of guitars warming up, the gentle thump of drums echoing through the afternoon air. In the summer of love, music isn't just something you listen to. It's something you wander into like a street festival that never quite ends. You follow the sound into Golden Gate Park, where a crowd has already gathered around a makeshift stage. Blankets are spread across the grass. People sit cross-legged, leaning against trees, passing around snacks and stories with equal enthusiasm. The band finally begins. The first guitar chord rings out across the park like a starting signal. Cheers ripple through the crowd. This is how the counterculture often expresses itself, not through speeches or political pamphlets, but through music. In the 1960s, rock music is changing quickly. The simple pop songs of the early decade are giving way to something louder, stranger, and far more experimental. Electric guitars scream instead of strum, drums thunder instead of politely tapping along. And the lyrics begin asking bigger questions about war, freedom, love, and the strange confusion of modern life. Bands like Jefferson Airplane help define the sound of San Francisco itself. Their music blends rock, folk, and psychedelic influences into songs that feel both rebellious and strangely hopeful. Nearby, someone mentions the Grateful Dead, a band that has turned improvisation into an art form. Their concerts rarely follow the rules of traditional music. A song might begin normally enough, then wander off into a 10-minute guitar jam that sounds like a musical road trip through outer space. The crowd never seems to mind. In fact, the longer the song goes, the more relaxed everyone becomes. People sway gently. Some dance barefoot in the grass. Others lie back and watch clouds drift overhead while the guitars spiral higher and higher. Music festivals and open-air concerts become gathering points for the entire movement. They are part celebration, part social experiment. Thousands of strangers sharing the same field, the same music, the same moment. Sometimes the performances are polished. Sometimes they are chaotic. Amplifiers fail. Microphones squeal. Guitarists forget which song they started playing 10 minutes ago. But none of that really matters, because the music isn't just about perfection. It's about feeling. You notice how easily the crowd connects with the performers. There's no sense of distance between stage and audience. The musicians are not distant celebrities yet. They are fellow travellers in the same cultural adventure. Many of them dress exactly like the crowd. Long hair, colourful shirts, and the relaxed posture of people who have been awake for several very philosophical nights. A tall man nearby leans toward you and gestures toward the stage. "This," he says quietly, "is the revolution." You glance at the band again. A guitarist bends a note so high it seems to float over the entire park. The drummer closes his eyes and plays with quiet intensity. The singer lifts her voice above the sound of the crowd, and for a moment it does feel a little revolutionary, because music in this era carries something more than rhythm. It carries identity. It carries protest. Songs criticize war, celebrate peace, question authority. They give an entire generation a language for feelings they haven't quite figured out how to explain yet. And perhaps most importantly, music gives everyone a place to gather. A shared soundtrack for a world that suddenly feels uncertain and new. The song finally winds down after a long swirling guitar solo. Applause rolls across the park. Someone immediately shouts for another. The band grins and starts tuning. Again. Because in the summer of love, concerts don't really have a schedule. They simply continue until the sun sets, the amplifiers give up, or someone remembers they were supposed to make dinner. And judging by the crowd around you, dinner might be very late tonight. Eventually, some hippies decided that simply rejecting society wasn't enough. They wanted to build entirely new communities, enter the Commune, a place where everyone shared food, land, responsibilities, and occasionally deeply awkward conversations about feelings. The idea was cooperation instead of competition. In reality, it often turned into a group of people discovering that farming is significantly harder than playing guitar. You arrive at the Commune sometime in the late afternoon. The road that brought you here started as pavement, turned into gravel, and eventually became a dirt path that seems to believe strongly in potholes. The land stretches out in front of you, rolling fields, a few scattered wooden buildings, and a garden that appears enthusiastic but slightly confused. A hand-painted sign near the entrance reads, "Welcome home." Someone greets you with a warm smile and a handshake that lasts slightly longer than most handshakes you have experienced. "We're building something new here," they say. You look around. The place has potential. A few small cabins sit near the edge of a field. There's a vegetable garden with rows of tomatoes, beans and carrots, doing their best to grow in neat lines. Chickens wander through the grass like tiny supervisors. In the distance, someone is strumming a guitar under a tree. This is the dream many hippies imagined, a life away from crowded cities and rigid social expectations. Communes began popping up across the United States during the late 1960s. Some were rural farms, others were shared houses in cities. But the idea was always the same: people working together, sharing resources, living simply. You follow your guide toward the main building, which is a large wooden farmhouse that appears to have been renovated by several very optimistic volunteers. Inside, a chalkboard lists the day's responsibilities: water the garden, collect eggs, prepare dinner, repair the roof that has been labelled still leaking. Chores, it turns out, are a major part of communal life, because once you move away from grocery stores, landlords and electric companies, you suddenly become responsible for a surprising number of things. Food doesn't appear magically in bowls. Someone has to grow it. And growing food requires planning, patience, and an uncomfortable amount of early mornings. You walk through the garden where several people are working. One person is watering plants. Another is pulling weeds with the focused determination of someone who has recently learned what weeds are. A third person appears to be giving the tomatoes encouraging advice. "This one's doing great," they say proudly. You nod politely, because it does look like a very motivated tomato. Communal living relies on cooperation. Everyone contributes according to their abilities. Some people cook, some build structures, others tend the garden or care for animals. In theory, the workload spreads evenly. In practice, it can become a little uneven. Some residents are excellent farmers, others are excellent philosophers, and while philosophical discussions are deeply appreciated, they are not always helpful when the chickens escape. You hear laughter near the barn where two people are attempting to fix a fence. The repair involves several tools, a length of wire, and a spirited debate about the spiritual symbolism of fences in general. Communes often hold daily meetings where everyone gathers to discuss decisions. These meetings can last a while, possibly several hours. Consensus is important. Everyone's voice matters, which means that deciding something simple, like what to plant next season, may involve a thoughtful conversation about soil health, personal expression, and the emotional needs of carrots. Still, the atmosphere here is warm. People share meals together at long wooden tables. They play music in the evenings. They talk about the future in hopeful, expansive ways. For many, the commune represents something rare, a chance to live deliberately, to step away from the noise of modern life and build a community from scratch. It's idealistic, sometimes messy, occasionally chaotic. But as the sun sets over the fields and the group gathers for dinner, the laughter drifting across the farm feels genuine, and you realize something important. Building a new society might be complicated, but at least here, nobody expects you to wear a suit while doing it. Although tomorrow morning someone is definitely going to ask you to feed the chickens. Communal living sounds wonderful until someone has to wash the dishes. At first, everyone promises to share responsibilities equally, but within a few weeks, the same too. People are doing most of the work while the rest of the commune debates spiritual energy near a campfire. Turns out even utopia struggles with basic household management. You discover this shortly after dinner. Dinner itself was pleasant. A large pot of vegetable stew sat in the centre of the table, while everyone passed around bread, rice, and a jar of honey that received the kind of respect usually reserved for rare artifacts. People laughed. Stories were shared. Someone played a soft melody on a guitar while the sun dipped behind the trees. For a moment, the commune felt like a perfect little society. Then the meal ended, and everyone slowly turned to look at the mountain of dishes. It's impressive. Bowls stacked like tiny ceramic skyscrapers, spoons scattered across the table, one enormous stew pot with the stubborn residue of several very enthusiastic servings. Someone clears their throat. "Well," a voice says, "we should probably clean up." Everyone nods thoughtfully. Several. People nod very thoughtfully. The kind of thoughtful nod that suggests they support the idea of dishes being cleaned. You wait. Nothing happens. One person stands up, stretches, and wanders outside to check the sunset. Another remembers they promised to help tune the guitar. Someone else suddenly becomes deeply invested in a conversation about whether carrots have emotional memory. Meanwhile, the dishes remain. Eventually, two people step forward. There's almost always a pair like this in every commune, the practical ones. The people who understand that while philosophical freedom is wonderful, someone still needs to scrub the oatmeal pot. You follow them to the outdoor wash station. It's a wooden table beside a large metal basin filled with water drawn from a nearby pump. Soap sits in a small dish beside a rag that has clearly seen many heroic battles against soup residue. One of the volunteers hands you a bowl. "Welcome to communal responsibility," they say with a smile. You begin scrubbing. The system in theory is simple. Everyone contributes to daily chores: cooking, cleaning, gardening, repairs. No bosses, no strict hierarchy, just shared effort. But as the weeks pass in many communes across the country, a familiar pattern often appears. Some people become very skilled at doing chores. Others become very skilled at discussing chores. Back inside the farmhouse, you hear the campfire conversation beginning to grow more animated. Someone is explaining the connection between cosmic energy and personal growth. Another person is describing a dream they had about a talking river. Meanwhile, the stew pot remains stubbornly attached to the sink, like a philosophical test of patience. You scrub a little harder. Communal living relies heavily on goodwill. Most residents arrive with genuine hopes of building a fair, cooperative community. But humans, as it turns out, are wonderfully complicated creatures. Some wake up early to tend the garden, others wake up early to think about tending the garden. Both are technically participating in the experience, though one group is slightly more helpful when tomatoes need watering. You rinse another bowl. The person beside you laughs quietly. Every commune has this moment, they say. What moment? The moment where everyone realizes utopia still needs someone to take out the trash. You glance back toward the farmhouse where the campfire discussion has now expanded to include the philosophical importance of wind. It's oddly comforting, because despite the uneven chores and the occasionally suspicious stew pot, the commune still feels alive with possibility. People are trying something different. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they accidentally invent a 4-hour conversation about dishwashing ethics. Eventually, the final bowl is rinsed and placed carefully on the drying rack. You wipe your hands on a towel and look up at the darkening sky. The campfire group is still talking. The guitar starts playing again, and you realize something quietly amusing about the grand experiment of communal living. Changing the world might be complicated, but convincing everyone to wash their own bowl, that might be the real revolution. Now we arrive at the concept of free love, which sounds poetic and romantic until you realize it mostly meant complicated emotional situations with very little privacy. Traditional rules about relationships were thrown out in favor of openness and experimentation. This created a world where jealousy, confusion, and extremely awkward conversations became common daily events. You first hear the phrase while sitting around the evening campfire at the commune. The fire crackles softly. Someone strums a slow rhythm on a guitar. A few people sit on blankets, staring thoughtfully into the flames as if the fire might offer relationship advice. A tall man with round glasses gestures broadly. "Love," he says with calm confidence, "should be free." Everyone nods, because in theory, That sounds wonderful. The philosophy behind free love grows out of the larger counterculture movement of the 1960s. Many young people begin questioning traditional expectations about dating, marriage, and long-term relationships. The older generation often views romance through strict social rules: courtship, engagement, marriage, and the quiet hope that everyone behaves properly along the way. The counterculture takes one look at those rules and decides to try something different. Instead of commitment being the starting point, many hippies believe relationships should form naturally, freely, without social pressure or rigid expectations. Love, they argue, should not be owned. It should be shared. You listen carefully while someone explains this beside the fire. People should connect with whoever they feel connected to, they say. No jealousy, no control. It's a beautiful idea. Very idealistic. Also slightly complicated. Because humans, as it turns out, sometimes experience emotions that are not easily solved with philosophy. Across the commune, relationships form quickly. People bond over music, shared meals, long late-night conversations about the nature of existence. Sometimes those connections last. Sometimes they change within a week. And because everyone lives in close quarters, shared cabins, shared gardens, shared kitchens, privacy becomes something of a luxury. You notice a couple sitting quietly near the edge of the field, having what appears to be a very serious conversation. Another group nearby is discussing emotional honesty with the intense focus normally reserved for international diplomacy. Free love creates a social environment where feelings are discussed constantly, jealousy is analysed, attachment is debated. Someone eventually introduces the phrase emotional openness, which becomes the commune's polite way of saying, we need to talk. And talk they do, late into the night, under the stars, next to the campfire, often with several other people offering thoughtful suggestions about personal growth. You begin to realise that relationships inside the counterculture can involve a surprising number of group discussions. Imagine trying to explain your feelings to 3 people, 2 guitars, and a dog that wandered into the conversation halfway through. It is an experience. But beneath the occasional awkwardness lies something sincere. Many people truly want to build relationships based on honesty instead of obligation. They believe love should grow from genuine connection rather than social expectation. And in a time when many traditional institutions are being questioned, from politics to education to war, it makes sense that relationships would also become part of the experiment. Still, the emotional landscape becomes complicated. Feelings develop, feelings change, and every now and then someone discovers that philosophical detachment is slightly harder when the person you like is suddenly writing poetry for someone else. Back by the campfire, the guitar player shifts into a slow melody. The group grows quiet. The flames flicker softly in the dark. Someone sighs and says thoughtfully, "Love is a journey." Everyone nods again. Because in the summer of love, relationships are not simple. They are fluid, philosophical, occasionally confusing, and sometimes involve conversations so long that by the end of them nobody quite remembers what the original question was. Beyond the flower crowns and music festivals, the hippie movement had a serious political backbone. Many young Americans were furious about the Vietnam War. Massive protests filled city streets and college campuses. Demonstrators marched with signs, sang protest songs, and demanded peace. The energy was powerful, emotional, and sometimes chaotic. You first encounter it in the middle of a march. One moment you're walking through the streets of San Francisco, minding your own peaceful hippie business, and the next moment you turn a corner and find yourself surrounded by hundreds of people moving in the same direction. Someone hands you a sign. You're not entirely sure who handed it to you, but suddenly you're holding a piece of cardboard that reads simply, "Make love, not war." It's catchy, also extremely direct. The Vietnam War has become one of the defining issues of the late 1960s. By this point, thousands of American soldiers are already fighting in Southeast Asia, and the conflict is growing larger every year. Television news shows images of combat almost nightly. Young men across the country face the possibility of being drafted into the military through a system that feels frighteningly random. And a growing number of Americans, especially young Americans, are beginning to question it. You move along with the crowd as the march winds through the city streets. Students walk beside musicians, veterans walk beside professors, some people carry flowers, others carry handmade signs painted in bold letters that demand peace, justice, and the immediate end of the war. Someone nearby begins singing. It's a simple folk melody, the kind that spreads easily through a crowd. Within minutes, dozens of voices join in. The song floats through the air between tall buildings like a shared heartbeat. Music, once again, becomes the language of the movement. Protest songs by artists like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Country Joe McDonald turn political frustration into melodies people can sing together. And there is a lot of frustration. Many protesters believe the war is unjust. Others feel the government has been dishonest about the conflict's progress and purpose. College campuses become centres of debate, where students organise rallies, teach-ins and demonstrations that last late into the night. You notice the march feels both serious and strangely hopeful. People chant slogans, they clap. Some march silently, holding candles or flowers. A group of students carries a long banner that reads "End the War Now," the letters slightly crooked but the message very clear. At the front of the crowd, a speaker climbs onto the back of a truck and begins addressing the gathering through a crackling microphone. "We're here," he says, "because we believe our voices matter." Applause spreads through the crowd like a wave. The protests grow larger each year. Some attract thousands of participants. Others draw even more attention when clashes break out between demonstrators and police. For many young Americans, marching in these protests becomes part of the counterculture experience. It's not just about music or communal living anymore. It's about politics, about challenging authority, about demanding that the country take a different path. You walk beside a group of college students who are debating strategy. One argues that peaceful demonstrations will eventually change public opinion. Another insists that stronger action is necessary. Both agree on one thing: the conversation is no longer quiet. Across the nation, the anti-war movement continues to grow. Newspapers print photographs of enormous rallies in Washington, D.C. College campuses erupt with student activism. The generation that once quietly followed authority now questions it openly. The atmosphere becomes charged, passionate, occasionally unpredictable. But beneath all the noise and chanting lies a simple demand: stop the war. As the march slows near a large park, the crowd gradually begins to disperse. People sit in the grass, catching their breath and sharing water bottles. Someone begins playing a guitar again, because in the counterculture, even political protests often end with music. You lower the sign you've been carrying and glance around at the crowd. Thousands of voices, all insisting that the world can be different. It's powerful, a little chaotic, and you realize something quietly remarkable. For a movement often remembered for tie-dye shirts and flower crowns, the hippies also knew how to organize one very loud afternoon. Meanwhile, parents across America were watching this entire situation unfold with absolute confusion. To them, their children had suddenly grown their hair to shoulder length, rejected stable careers, and moved to cities where strangers handed out flowers. Family dinners became tense discussions about responsibility, patriotism, and why someone had traded law school for a tambourine. You experience the generation gap the moment you write home. It seems like a polite thing to do, After all, your parents are probably wondering where you disappeared to after announcing that you were going to explore new ideas in California. So you sit down at a small wooden table with a pen and a piece of paper and begin composing a letter. Dear Mum and Dad, everything is great. I'm living in a community now. You pause. The word community feels safe. It sounds organised, responsible even. You do not mention that the community currently contains 12 people, 3 guitars, 2 chickens, and a philosophical debate about whether laundry is a capitalist concept. Back in suburbia, life continues at its usual rhythm. Your father wakes up early, reads the newspaper, and goes to work in a building where everyone wears neatly pressed shirts. Your mother shops for groceries in stores where the vegetables are arranged politely and nobody is playing a tambourine near the bread aisle. And every evening the television delivers the news, which increasingly includes stories about young Americans with long hair gathering in parks, marching in protests, and forming communes in places that appear suspiciously muddy. From their perspective, the whole thing is baffling. They raised a generation expecting stability, careers, families, a respectable house with a lawn that requires mowing every Saturday. Instead, their children have invented something called dropping out, and the results appear to involve a surprising amount of barefoot walking. At family dinners across the country, conversations begin to shift. Parents ask careful questions. So what exactly are you planning to do? Young people respond with ideas about creativity, freedom, and changing society. The conversation grows quiet. Then someone inevitably asks about employment. It's not that parents don't care about their children's ideals. Many of them lived through difficult times themselves. The Great Depression, World War II, years when survival required discipline and structure. To them, the hippie movement can look less like a revolution and more like a very colourful misunderstanding. Hair becomes one of the most visible symbols of the divide. For decades, American men have worn short, tidy hairstyles. Suddenly, thousands of young men begin growing their hair long, sometimes well past their shoulders. It's not just a fashion choice, it's a statement, a quiet way of saying, we are not going to live exactly the way you did. The reaction from older generations ranges from concern to outright panic. Barbers complain that business is collapsing. School administrators introduce rules about hair length. Some employers refuse to hire anyone who looks like they might also own a tambourine. You see the tension everywhere. A young couple walks past you on the street, laughing and carrying a stack of protest posters. Across the road, an older man watches them with a mixture of curiosity and exhaustion. 2 generations sharing the same sidewalk, but living in completely different worlds. And yet the gap is not always as wide as it appears. Some parents quietly begin to understand pieces of the movement. They may not love the tie-dye shirts, or the barefoot philosophy, but they recognize something familiar in the desire to build a better world. After all, every generation eventually questions the one before it. Even if this particular generation happens to be doing it while wearing beads and singing folk songs in public parks, you fold the letter carefully and place it in an envelope. Dear Mum and Dad, you write again. Don't worry about me, I'm learning a lot, which is technically true, because living through the 1960s counterculture teaches you many valuable lessons. For example, how to grow tomatoes, how to debate philosophy for 3 straight hours, and most importantly, how to explain to your parents why your new career plan currently involves a guitar. Ironically, the anti-capitalist movement quickly became very profitable for certain people. Shops began selling tie-dye clothing, beads, posters, incense, and psychedelic art. Record labels discovered that rebellion sold extremely well. Before long, the counterculture had its own thriving marketplace, proving once again that capitalism has an impressive ability to sell people, things designed to protest capitalism. You notice this the moment you walk down Haight Street. At first glance, it still looks like the carefree world you expected. Colourful clothes drifting through the sidewalks, guitars leaning against brick walls, and the occasional philosophical conversation happening next to a mailbox. But then you start noticing the storefronts. One shop window displays racks of tie-dye shirts in swirling galaxies of colour. Another sells long strings of beads and leather bracelets arranged like tiny treasures. A third shop offers incense in jars labelled with mystical names like Cosmic Garden and Transcendental Sunrise. You pause outside a store called the Psychedelic shop. Inside, shelves are filled with posters covered in swirling patterns and glowing letters that seem to dance even when you're standing perfectly still. The artwork advertises concerts, festivals, and mysterious gatherings where music apparently lasts until sunrise. You step inside. A bell rings softly above the door. The air smells like sandalwood and something faintly sweet. A record player spins quietly near the counter while customers wander between displays of posters, candles, embroidered vests, and books about meditation. It's peaceful, also very organised, which is slightly ironic, because many of the people shopping here came to hate Ashbury specifically to escape the consumer culture of mainstream America. They rejected department stores, corporate advertising, and the idea that happiness could be purchased. And yet here they are, purchasing things, just different things. Instead of buying a suit and briefcase, someone buys a poncho and a peace sign necklace. Instead of a corporate advertisement, there's a psychedelic poster announcing a concert by the Grateful Dead. Instead of perfume counters, there are tables stacked with incense and handmade soaps that promise spiritual clarity. The counterculture, it turns out, has developed its own economy. You hear two shop owners chatting near the register. People want something authentic, one says. The other nods. And authenticity sells pretty well. It's not just clothing and incense. Music becomes one of the biggest industries surrounding the movement. Record companies quickly realize that the sound of rebellion is extremely popular. Bands that once played small neighborhood venues now fill massive concert halls. Albums sell by the millions. Posters, magazines, and radio stations begin celebrating the culture that once lived quietly on the fringes of society. Even the language of the movement becomes marketable. Words like freedom, peace, and consciousness appear on shirts, stickers, and album covers. A philosophy that began as a rejection of consumer culture slowly finds itself printed neatly onto merchandise. You walk past another shop selling handmade jewellery. A young woman sits outside weaving bracelets while a small crowd watches. Each bracelet is slightly different, colourful threads woven carefully together. $2, she says cheerfully, which raises an interesting question. Is it still anti-capitalist if you charge $2? No one seems overly concerned about the contradiction. Because for many people, the shops represent something positive. They allow artists, musicians, and craftspeople to support themselves while participating in the movement. Creative work replaces traditional office jobs. Handmade goods replace factory products. In that sense, the marketplace feels less corporate and more communal. Still, the irony remains quietly amusing. A movement dedicated to rejecting the system has somehow created its own thriving version of the system. You leave the shop with a small bag containing incense sticks and a poster advertising an upcoming concert in Golden Gate Park. Outside, the street buzzes with music and conversation. Tie-dye shirts ripple in the sunlight. Someone strums a guitar near the corner. A vendor sells homemade bread from a wooden crate. You glance at the poster again. Apparently the revolution begins tonight at 7 p.m. Tickets are $5. Cash only. Whenever large groups of young, idealists start searching for spiritual meaning, mysterious teachers tend to appear. The 1960s were full of gurus offering enlightenment, meditation techniques, and occasionally very expensive workshops. Some were sincere spiritual leaders, Others were extremely charismatic men who discovered that saying vague philosophical sentences could lead to impressive housing arrangements. You encounter one of them on a sunny afternoon in Golden Gate Park. A small crowd has gathered beneath a tall eucalyptus tree. People sit cross-legged in a loose circle, while a man in flowing white robes speaks slowly, pausing every few sentences in a way that suggests what he just said was extremely important. True freedom, he says softly, comes from understanding the self. Everyone nods. You nod too, just to stay consistent with the group. The 1960s counterculture is not only about politics or music. Many young people feel that modern Western life has become spiritually empty. Traditional institutions, churches, governments, corporations seem unable to answer the deeper questions about purpose, identity, and meaning. So naturally people start looking elsewhere. Eastern philosophies begin attracting attention across the United States. Meditation, yoga, and Buddhist teachings appear in conversations that once revolved mostly around football scores and dinner plans. For many, these ideas feel refreshing. Instead of rigid rules, they offer reflection. Instead of authority, they offer personal insight. And sometimes they offer a peaceful hour sitting quietly in a park, which honestly sounds pretty nice. Some teachers arrive from abroad. Indian spiritual leaders, Buddhist monks and meditation instructors travel to American cities to share traditions that had been largely unfamiliar to Western audiences. Others arrive with slightly less clear credentials. You listen while the man beneath the eucalyptus tree continues speaking. The universe, he says, thoughtfully, is like a river. Someone nearby whispers, "Wow." He pauses again. "And you," he adds, "are the boat." The crowd murmurs in appreciation. You consider the statement carefully. It sounds meaningful. You're just not entirely sure what it means. The popularity of spiritual teachers grows rapidly throughout the counterculture. Many young people are eager to learn meditation techniques, explore Eastern philosophy, or simply hear someone speak calmly about the nature of the mind. Books about spirituality circulate widely. Meditation groups form in apartments and community centers. Yoga classes begin appearing in cities where most people had never heard the word yoga a few years earlier. For many seekers, these teachings genuinely provide comfort and guidance. But whenever large crowds gather around new ideas, something else tends to happen. Charisma becomes valuable. Some teachers discover that speaking slowly, wearing flowing robes, and occasionally mentioning cosmic energy can attract quite a following, a very loyal following. Sometimes those followers bring gifts, food, clothing, or very comfortable houses where the guru can stay while continuing to explain the deeper mysteries of existence. You glance around the circle. The man in white robes is now describing the importance of inner peace, while someone quietly hands him a cup of herbal tea. He accepts it with serene gratitude. Nearby, two listeners are taking careful notes in small notebooks. Another person closes their eyes as if trying to absorb every word directly into their soul. You can't help noticing that being a spiritual teacher in the 1960s, counterculture appears to come with certain advantages. Flexible working hours, admiring audiences, and very few performance reviews. Still, it would be unfair to dismiss the entire movement as theatrical. Many people truly are searching for meaning. The world in the late 1960s feels turbulent. War, social upheaval, political tension. In uncertain times, the promise of inner peace becomes very appealing. The speaker finishes his talk with a long pause. "Remember," he says finally, "enlightenment is already within you." The crowd sits quietly for a moment. Then someone begins clapping softly. Others join in. The guru smiles gently and closes his eyes as if acknowledging a universal truth. You stand up and stretch your legs. As you walk away, you reflect on what you just witnessed. Some teachers are wise, some are charismatic, and some have simply discovered that if you speak slowly enough about the universe, people might bring you tea. While psychedelics were often described as tools for spiritual awakening, not everyone had enlightening experiences. Drug use sometimes spiraled into addiction, confusion, and serious health problems. What began as a quest for expanded consciousness occasionally turned into a harsh lesson about chemistry and human limits. You begin to notice it gradually. At first, the conversations around drugs sound thoughtful and philosophical. People talk about expanding the mind, breaking through mental barriers, and discovering hidden layers of reality. It all sounds very poetic, almost scientific, almost spiritual. But after spending more time in Haight-Ashbury, you start hearing different stories. Not everyone is having cosmic revelations while staring at trees. Some people are having a very bad afternoon. The truth is that the drug culture of the late 1960s grows faster than anyone fully understands. Substances like LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, and marijuana are often described as tools for exploring consciousness. But the movement doesn't stop there. Other drugs begin circulating quietly through the same communities. Amphetamines, barbiturates, and eventually heroin appear alongside the psychedelic experimentation. And unlike the dreamy spiritual language used to describe LSD, these substances bring much heavier consequences. You hear a conversation about it one evening near the edge of the park. Two people sit on a blanket speaking quietly. Too many people are going too far, one says. The other nods. At the beginning of the counterculture movement, many participants believed psychedelics could open the mind safely when used carefully. Early advocates even hoped these substances might help people become more peaceful, more creative, more connected to the world. But reality proves more complicated. Drugs affect people differently. One person may feel wonder and clarity. Another may experience panic, confusion, or emotional distress. And because these substances are often taken in unpredictable environments, with unfamiliar people, unfamiliar doses, and very little medical supervision, the risks grow quickly. You see it sometimes in the neighbourhood. A young man sitting alone on a sidewalk staring at the ground, with the exhausted expression of someone who hasn't slept properly in days. A friend gently guiding someone through a difficult experience in the middle of the night. A quiet tension in conversations that usually revolve around peace and harmony. In 1967, the Summer of Love draws thousands of young people to San Francisco. Many arrive with idealistic hopes of freedom and community. But the sudden population boom also brings overcrowding, homelessness, and a surge in drug use that local clinics struggle to manage. A free medical clinic eventually opens in the neighbourhood to help treat people experiencing bad reactions, overdoses, and psychological distress. The doctors and volunteers there work long hours, quietly supporting a movement that sometimes struggles with its own excesses. Most hippies don't like talking about this side of the culture. It interrupts the hopeful narrative. After all, the movement was built on the idea that expanding consciousness would lead to a more peaceful world. But chemistry has its own rules, and the human mind, it turns out, can only be stretched so far before it starts pushing back. You hear a former Commune member explain it one night by the fire. "We thought we were discovering freedom," he says. "What did you discover instead?" someone asks. He stares at the flames for a moment. That freedom needs boundaries. The fire crackles quietly while the group sits in thoughtful silence. For many people in the counterculture, the psychedelic experiment remains an important part of the journey. Some genuinely believe it helped them see the world differently. But others come away with a more cautious understanding. Not every door the mind opens leads somewhere safe, and sometimes the most valuable discovery isn't the one that comes from taking something new. Sometimes it's the one that comes from realizing you've already gone far enough. By 1969, the movement reached its most famous moment. Woodstock. Hundreds of thousands of young people gathered on a muddy field in New York to celebrate music, peace, and the idea that a new generation was changing the world. It was chaotic, overcrowded, and legendary. For many participants, it felt like proof that the dream was real. You arrive sometime late in the afternoon. The road leading to the farm is completely surrendered. Cars are parked for miles in every direction, abandoned like colourful metal breadcrumbs stretching across the countryside. People walk along the highway carrying backpacks, sleeping bags and guitars, all heading toward the same destination. Someone laughs and shouts, "We're almost there!" You're not entirely sure where there is, but you follow the crowd anyway. Eventually the trees open up and you see it. A massive field filled with people, not dozens, not hundreds, hundreds of thousands. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair was originally expected to attract maybe 50,000 visitors. Instead, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people show up across the three-day festival in August 1969, which means the organisers are now managing the population of a small city, with approximately the planning of a family picnic. You walk down the hillside toward the stage. The ground beneath your feet is already soft from the constant movement of thousands of people. Blankets are spread across the grass like colourful islands. Food stands attempt to keep up with the crowd, while volunteers wander through offering water in directions that sound increasingly optimistic. The air hums with anticipation. Somewhere on stage a band is tuning their instruments. The sound of electric guitars drifts across the valley like distant thunder. Music is about to begin, and when it does, the crowd erupts. Cheers roll across the hillside in waves. People clap, whistle, and shout with a pure joy of being part of something enormous. For many here, Woodstock represents more than just a concert. It feels like a gathering of an entire generation. Artists take the stage one after another, Richie Haven's opening. The festival with improvised folk songs, Janis Joplin unleashing a voice that seems to tear through the night air, Santana delivering guitar solos that send the crowd into a kind of musical trance. And of course, Jimi Hendrix eventually arrives to close the festival with a performance so electrifying that people will talk about it for decades. His distorted version of the Star-Spangled Banner echoes across the muddy field like a question being asked directly to the nation. But before that moment arrives, nature decides to join the festival. The rain begins slowly. At first, people laugh and pull jackets over their heads. Then the rain becomes serious. The field transforms into a slippery sea of mud. Shoes disappear into the ground. Blankets become questionable life choices. People slide down the hillsides like enthusiastic but slightly confused penguins. Yet strangely, no one leaves. Instead, the crowd adapts. People dance in the mud. They share food with strangers. They help each other, up after inevitable sliding incidents that end in laughter instead of frustration. The atmosphere remains surprisingly peaceful, despite the overwhelming numbers. There are shortages of food, shortages of bathrooms, and occasional moments where everyone collectively realizes this might not have been the most carefully planned gathering in human history. But the spirit of cooperation holds. Neighbors share blankets, volunteers distribute supplies, musicians keep playing. At night, the field glows with thousands of tiny lights from lanterns and candles. Music floats through the cool air while people lie back on the grass, listening to guitar riffs echo beneath the stars. For a moment, just a moment, it feels like the entire experiment of the 1960s counterculture is gathered in one place. Hundreds of thousands of people living together peacefully, sharing music, food, and space without violence or chaos. You sit on the hillside watching the stage lights flicker against the night sky. Someone beside you whispers softly, "This is history." They might be right. because for many who attend Woodstock, the festival becomes the high point of the entire hippie era, the moment when the dream feels real. A generation standing together in a muddy field, believing that music, peace, and cooperation might actually change the world. Of course, the mud will eventually dry, the crowd will go home, and reality will return with its usual collection of responsibilities. But for these few strange days in August 1969, 500,000 people managed to prove one thing. If nothing else, the hippies were very good at throwing a party, even if nobody remembered to bring enough bathrooms. Unfortunately, when hundreds of thousands of people gather in one muddy field with limited bathrooms, reality begins to assert itself. Hygiene becomes complicated. Food lines stretch for hours. Rain turns the ground into soup. And the romantic image of carefree freedom suddenly includes a lot of damp socks and questionable smells. You realise this sometime on the second day. At first, the atmosphere still feels magical. Music echoes across the valley, people laugh easily, and strangers share whatever food they manage to bring along. But the rain has not stopped. The field that once looked like a peaceful meadow now resembles a giant bowl of chocolate pudding. Every step produces a wet squelching sound that feels slightly personal. Your shoes are gone. Not metaphorically, they are physically gone. Somewhere between walking down the hillside and attempting to reach the food area, the mud has claimed them as a permanent sacrifice to the gods of poor festival planning. You decide barefoot might be the wiser strategy. Around you, thousands of other people have reached the same conclusion. Woodstock has officially become the largest barefoot gathering in American history. The mud is everywhere now. People slide down hillsides, occasionally laughing as they go. Blankets are soaked, jackets are damp. One optimistic soul attempts to dry their socks over a small campfire that looks deeply concerned about its own survival. And then there are the bathrooms. Originally, the organisers planned for a crowd of about 50,000 people. Instead, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people have arrived. This creates what mathematicians might describe as a logistical situation. You approach the row of portable toilets. The line stretches so far into the distance that it appears to have its own weather system. Someone ahead of you mutters calmly, "Well, this might take a while." People wait patiently, shifting their weight from foot to foot while the mud slowly attempts to absorb their ankles. Behind you, someone begins playing a guitar, because apparently even bathroom lines at Woodstock require musical accompaniment. Food presents another small adventure. The vendors who originally planned to sell meals to a modest crowd now face an army of hungry festival goers who have been dancing in the rain for hours. Lines for sandwiches and soup stretch across the field like long, hopeful snakes. Some people share food from backpacks. Others wander between groups asking politely if anyone has extra bread. You see strangers passing apples, granola, and peanut butter jars between blankets like a giant, slightly soggy picnic. It's chaotic, but it's also strangely cooperative. When someone slips in the mud, several hands reach out to help them back up. When a group finds extra food, they pass it along to the nearest neighbours. The lack of perfect organisation somehow turns into a different kind of order. Not planned, just improvised. You wander back toward the hillside where the music continues despite everything. A band is playing on stage while the crowd sways gently in the rain. The mud squishes beneath your feet, but no one seems particularly upset about it anymore. In fact, some people have started dancing, directly in the mud, not cautiously, enthusiastically. Someone slides past you like a joyful penguin and raises both arms toward the sky. "This is amazing," they shout. You pause and consider the situation carefully. You're standing barefoot in a muddy field surrounded by 500,000 people, waiting for food that may or may not arrive, listening to a guitar solo echo through the rain. And somehow it still feels like a celebration. because for many people here, the imperfections are part of the experience. The discomfort, the mess, the strange improvisation of it all, it proves that the gathering is real. Not polished, not controlled, just human. You sit down carefully on a damp patch of grass and watch the stage lights glow through the mist. Someone nearby wrings water out of their socks. Another person hands you half a sandwich without asking for anything in return. The music rises over the crowd again, and you realise something quietly important about the summer of love, generation. They might not have solved the problem of hygiene, but they were remarkably good at ignoring it. Back in communes across America, reality continues creeping in. Crops fail, money runs out, people argue about leadership. It turns out that building a sustainable society requires logistics, planning, and sometimes spreadsheets, none of which were particularly popular among people who moved to the woods to avoid schedules. You begin to notice the cracks during harvest season. All summer long, the commune had been optimistic. The garden was planted with enthusiasm. Rows of vegetables stretched across the field like promises written in soil. Everyone believed the land would provide. After all, nature was on their side. Unfortunately, nature sometimes has its own schedule. The tomatoes grow well enough, but the corn struggles. The beans produce less than expected. A sudden cold snap arrives a few weeks earlier than anyone planned for, which would be less alarming if anyone had actually planned for it. You stand in the garden with a small basket examining what is technically a carrot. It is determined. Also extremely small. Nearby, 2 residents are debating the situation. "We just need better energy around the crops," one says confidently. The other suggests the plants might actually prefer water. The commune, like many others scattered across the country, had started with an inspiring vision. Groups of young people moved onto shared land with the goal of building self-sufficient communities. They imagined growing their own food, sharing resources, and living peacefully outside the pressures of modern society. In theory, it sounded beautiful. In practice, agriculture turns out to be a profession. Farmers spend years learning about soil conditions, irrigation, weather patterns, crop rotation, and pest control. It's not impossible work, but it does require experience, patience, and occasionally waking up before noon. 3 skills that were not always equally represented in the commune. Inside the farmhouse, a meeting has begun. Commune meetings are important. Everyone gathers in a large circle on the floor, where decisions are made through careful discussion and consensus. Today's topic is finances, which is slightly awkward, because there are very few finances. Someone reads aloud the contents of the community fund, a few crumpled bills, several coins, and what might be a concert ticket someone accidentally contributed. Another person raises a practical concern. If winter comes early, they say, we may need to buy more supplies. The room grows quiet. Buying supplies requires money. Money requires work. And work was the very thing many residents hoped to avoid when they first moved here. Leadership becomes another surprising challenge. Communes often begin with the idea that everyone is equal and decisions are shared, which sounds fair and democratic until something urgent needs to be decided quickly, like repairing the roof, or dealing with the chickens, who have once again discovered a hole in the fence and are now exploring the vegetable garden with remarkable enthusiasm. Someone eventually stands up. Maybe we should elect someone to organize things. The suggestion is met with thoughtful silence, because organizing things feels suspiciously close to authority. And authority was exactly what many people came here to escape. Still, reality continues tapping politely on the door. Food needs planting, tools need repairing, wood needs chopping before winter. Some residents adapt. They learn the rhythms of farming and community management. They wake earlier, work longer, and slowly develop the practical skills needed to keep the place running. Others decide the experiment might not be for them. One morning you notice a small car parked near the dirt road. Two people load their belongings into the back seat while the rest of the commune gathers to say goodbye. There are hugs, promises to visit, a quiet understanding that not every dream unfolds exactly the way it was imagined. As the car disappears down the dusty road, the remaining residents return to the garden. The tomatoes still need watering, the fence still needs fixing, and the tiny carrot in your basket still looks very proud of itself. You glance around at the field, the cabins, and the people who remain. Building a new society, it turns out, is slightly more complicated than expected. But at least one thing is certain. Tomorrow morning someone will definitely have to wake up early, because the chickens are already planning their next escape. Interestingly, even movements built on equality tend to produce leaders. Certain figures in the counterculture became extremely influential voices. Some used their influence responsibly. Others discovered that charismatic speeches and loyal followers could quickly turn into something closer to a personal kingdom. You first notice it during a gathering in the park. Dozens of people sit in a loose circle, beneath the shade of tall trees. Someone has brought a guitar, someone else has brought a large pot of tea, and the conversation drifts easily from music to philosophy to the future of humanity. But one voice rises above the others. A tall man with long hair and a confident smile stands in the centre of the group, speaking slowly and carefully. Every few sentences he pauses, allowing the words to settle into the crowd like thoughtful little raindrops. "We're not just rejecting the old world," he says. "We're building a new one. People listen. Really listen." Heads nod. A few people lean forward, as if the next sentence might contain the secret blueprint for a better society. Movements built around freedom often begin without clear leaders. The early hippie philosophy celebrates equality, shared decision-making, and the idea that no single person should hold power over others. Everyone's voice matters. Everyone's perspective is valuable. But humans are naturally drawn to certain personalities, people who speak confidently, organize gatherings, or seem to understand the direction of things when everyone else is still debating. And slowly, almost quietly, leaders begin to appear. Some become famous musicians whose songs shape the mood of an entire generation. Others become political organizers who help coordinate protests and rallies. A few become spiritual figures who speak about peace, love, and the mysteries of the universe. Sometimes these leaders help guide the movement in meaningful ways. They organize concerts that bring thousands together peacefully. They speak passionately against war and injustice. They help communities coordinate food, shelter, and medical care during chaotic gatherings like the Summer of Love. Charisma in those moments becomes a useful tool. But charisma can also be persuasive. You see another gathering later that evening at the Commune. A different speaker sits at the centre of the circle while a group listens carefully. He explains how the community should organise itself. He suggests certain rules. He recommends certain lifestyles. And gradually the suggestions begin to sound less like ideas and more like instructions. No one seems to mind at first. After all, it's comforting when someone appears confident about the future. If a person speaks passionately enough about peace and harmony, people often assume they must know what they're talking about. But occasionally the balance shifts. History has a way of showing that when large groups of hopeful people gather around powerful personalities, the results can vary widely. Some leaders inspire cooperation and creativity. Others discover that admiration from followers can slowly turn into something resembling authority. Communes sometimes revolve around a central figure who becomes the unofficial voice of the group. Festivals develop organisers whose opinions begin carrying more weight than others. The movement that once rejected hierarchy quietly develops its own version of influence. You watch one such leader finish speaking beneath the trees. The crowd applauds softly. A few people gather around him afterward, asking questions about philosophy, politics, and the direction of the movement. He answers patiently, smiling as he offers advice. You step back from the circle and observe the scene. There is something fascinating about it. A generation that set out to escape traditional authority is slowly discovering a familiar truth about human nature. People like guidance, they like confidence, and when the world feels uncertain, they often look for someone who seems to have answers. The guitars start playing again nearby, and the group slowly drifts into music and conversation. The evening feels calm again, but you realise something quietly important about the counterculture. Even revolutions built on equality sometimes end up with someone standing in the middle of the circle holding the microphone. As the movement grew, it attracted not only dreamers but also opportunists. Some individuals use the loose structure of the counterculture to run scams, exploit followers, or build dangerous cult-like communities. The most infamous examples would shock the nation and deeply damage the public image of the entire movement. You begin to hear about it in whispers, not during the daytime conversations about peace and harmony, but later in the evening when the guitars quiet down and people speak a little more cautiously. Someone mentions a group out in the desert. Another person talks about a commune that got strange. No one seems eager to explain further. The truth is that whenever a movement grows quickly, especially one built around freedom, experimentation, and the rejection of traditional rules, it inevitably attracts more than just idealists. For every person searching sincerely for a better way of living, another person might see something else entirely. Opportunity. The counterculture of the late 1960s is loose, decentralized, and filled with young people who are often far from home. Many have left families, jobs, and universities behind in pursuit of a different life. That kind of openness can be beautiful. It can also be vulnerable. You notice it in small ways first. A man wandering through the park selling mystical meditation lessons that mostly involve sitting quietly while he collects donations. Another person offering handmade charms that supposedly protect against negative cosmic energy. The line between creativity and opportunism sometimes becomes flexible, but in certain cases the consequences grow far more serious. Some charismatic figures begin gathering devoted followers around themselves, promising enlightenment, freedom, or secret knowledge about the world. Small communities form around these personalities, often in remote areas far from the cities where the counterculture began. At first, they look like many other communes: shared land, shared meals, long, philosophical discussions about the future of humanity. But sometimes the structure of these communities shifts. Instead of equality, one person's voice becomes absolute. Instead of shared decision-making, followers begin obeying instructions without question, and in the most troubling cases, those instructions become dangerous. You sit with a small group one evening as someone quietly mentions the most shocking example. In 1969, a group connected to Charles Manson, a drifter who had built a following among young counterculture seekers, committed a series of brutal murders in California. The crimes stunned the country. The idea that such violence could emerge from the same cultural landscape that talked endlessly about peace and love seemed almost impossible. Yet the connection was undeniable. Newspapers seized on the story immediately. Headlines across the nation began linking the crimes with a broader hippie movement. Long hair, communes, and alternative lifestyles suddenly looked far more sinister to people watching the news at home. For many Americans who were already suspicious of the counterculture, the murders confirmed their worst fears. The dream of peace and harmony suddenly had a very dark shadow. Around the campfire, the conversation grows quiet. One person stares into the flames for a long moment before speaking. That's not what this movement was supposed to be. Others nod slowly, because for most people living within the counterculture, the goal had always been kindness, community, and freedom. But the tragedy reveals something uncomfortable. Freedom without structure can sometimes create space for people who do not share the same values, and idealism alone cannot protect a community from manipulation. The fire crackles softly while the group sits in silence. Somewhere in the distance, a guitar begins playing again, soft, hesitant notes drifting through the night air. The music sounds a little different now, not darker, exactly, just more thoughtful. Because the counterculture experiment is discovering something important about human nature. Building a better world requires more than hope. It also requires knowing who you trust when someone says they have all the answers. By the early 1970s, mainstream media coverage shifted dramatically. What had once been portrayed as a hopeful youth movement was increasingly depicted as chaotic, naive, and dangerous. Stories of crime, drugs, and failed communes began replacing images of peaceful festivals. You notice the change on a television in a small diner. The set sits above the counter, humming quietly while customers sip coffee and read newspapers. The news anchor speaks in the calm, steady voice that suggests everything being reported is extremely important. Behind him, images flash across the screen. Crowded streets, police lines, young people with long hair sitting on sidewalks surrounded by reporters. The tone feels very different from a few years earlier. Back in 1967, the counterculture had been treated with a strange mixture of curiosity and amusement. Newspapers sent journalists to Haight-Ashbury to observe the Summer of Love, often describing it as a colourful social experiment. Reporters wrote about flower crowns, music festivals, and young people searching for meaning in a rapidly changing world. The coverage had been sceptical sometimes, but also fascinated. Now the fascination is fading. You glance at the newspaper lying open on the diner counter. The headline mentions drugs. Another article describes a commune that collapsed after financial problems and internal disputes. A third story discusses crime in neighbourhoods that had once been considered peaceful gathering places for the movement. The narrative is shifting. Where reporters once saw idealistic young dreamers, they now increasingly see disorder. You sit in a booth listening to the broadcast. The anchor describes rising tensions between protesters and police during demonstrations across college campuses. Footage shows crowds shouting slogans while officers stand nearby in helmets and uniforms. A few years ago, the story might have focused on the music or the message. Now the camera seems more interested in the conflict. Media coverage, after all, thrives on drama. And the early 1970s provide plenty of it. The Vietnam War continues dividing the country. Political protests grow larger and sometimes more confrontational. Drug use becomes more visible in cities associated with the counterculture. Even Woodstock, the famous festival that once symbolized peaceful cooperation, is sometimes re-examined through a more critical lens. Yes, the music had been extraordinary, but the logistics had been chaotic. The rain, the mud, the food shortages. Suddenly the story sounds less like a miracle of community and more like a warning about poor planning. You notice people in the diner watching the television carefully. An older man shakes his head. Kids these days, he mutters. Across the room, a younger couple exchanges a quiet glance. The counterculture is no longer just a cultural curiosity. It has become a national debate. Supporters argue the movement has raised important questions about war, civil rights, and the direction of American society. Critics argue it represents irresponsibility, lawlessness, and the collapse of traditional values. The media plays a powerful role in shaping that conversation. Images of protests and arrests circulate widely. Stories about drugs and crime dominate headlines. Television broadcasts bring the tensions of the era directly into living rooms across the country. And gradually, the public mood begins to shift. The bright optimism of the late 1960s fades into something more complicated. You finish your coffee and step outside into the afternoon sunlight. The street looks ordinary again, cars passing, people heading to work, a newspaper vendor stacking fresh editions on a corner stand. Somewhere in a nearby park, someone is still playing a guitar. The music hasn't stopped. But the story being told about the movement is changing, and once the media decides the narrative has shifted, it rarely changes back. Meanwhile, many former hippies gradually drifted back into ordinary society. The dream of dropping out gave way to the practical need for rent money, groceries, and occasionally health insurance. Some cut their hair, found careers, and quietly re-entered the very system they once rejected. You start noticing it slowly. At first, it's just a few familiar faces disappearing from the usual gathering spots. Someone who used to play guitar in the park every afternoon suddenly isn't there anymore. A couple from the Commune mentions they're heading back to the city for a while. No one makes a big announcement. There are no farewell speeches about returning to society. People simply pack their belongings, hug their friends, and drive, away in cars that have seen a few too many philosophical road trips. The late 1960s had been filled with grand ideas about dropping out of the system entirely. Many young Americans believed they could step away from traditional careers, suburban expectations, and corporate jobs and build a completely new way of life. But eventually, reality starts asking practical questions, like how to pay for groceries, or rent, or the occasional unexpected dentist visit that turns out to be much more expensive than a discussion about cosmic harmony. You see it in small details. A former Commune resident shows up one afternoon wearing a neatly buttoned shirt instead of a tie-dye tunic. Another mentions they've started taking classes again at a nearby college. Someone else talks about a job opportunity, not a philosophical job, a regular job, the kind with a schedule and occasionally a name tag. Hair begins to shorten, not dramatically at first, just a little trim here and there, enough to keep it from falling into soup bowls or getting caught in bicycle chains. Clothing changes too. The flowing robes and patched denim slowly give way to simpler outfits that are slightly easier to wear in offices where the boss might not fully appreciate a necklace made of curtain beads. It's not always a rejection of the counterculture. Many former hippies still carry pieces of it with them. They continue listening to the same music. They still believe in peace, environmental protection, and the importance of questioning authority. Some of them even bring those values into their new careers. A former protest organizer becomes a teacher. A commune gardener studies environmental science. A musician starts working at a radio station. The ideals don't disappear. They just adapt. You see one such moment in a small apartment kitchen late one evening. A man who once lived at the Commune stands at the stove making pasta. His hair is shorter now, though still a little longer than most office workers might consider traditional. He laughs while stirring the pot. Turns out, he says, you can't pay the electric bill with good vibes. Someone across the table nods thoughtfully. That's true, they reply, but good vibes help while you're working overtime. The room fills with quiet laughter. For many people, the transition back into mainstream life isn't dramatic. It's gradual, almost gentle. Responsibilities appear slowly. Rent payments, relationships, careers that require alarm clocks. The grand dream of completely escaping society fades. But something else takes its place. Experience. The generation that once marched through parks carrying flowers now steps into adulthood carrying a different perspective. They have seen what happens when you question the rules, experiment with community, and try, sometimes awkwardly, to imagine a different world. You walk down a city street and notice the changes everywhere. A former hippie runs a small bookstore, another manages a cafe where folk music still plays softly in the background. A third works at a community clinic that treats people who might not otherwise afford medical care. The movement didn't disappear, simply blended into everyday life. You pause at a street corner and watch the evening traffic pass. People hurry home from work. A radio somewhere plays a familiar guitar riff from the late 1960s, and you realise something quietly amusing about the entire counterculture experiment. Many of the people who once tried to leave the system eventually returned, just with better music, slightly longer hair, and a lingering suspicion that the world could still be improved, one paycheck at a time. Despite its contradictions, the hippie movement left a lasting impact on American culture. Environmentalism, alternative medicine, organic food, meditation, and many modern social movements trace their roots back to this chaotic era of experimentation. You begin to notice the legacy in small places. A grocery store shelf filled with foods labelled organic. A yoga studio tucked between a coffee shop and a bookstore. A park where people gather on weekends to practice meditation or talk about protecting the environment. At first glance, these things feel ordinary, almost normal. But if you travel back just a few decades, they would have seemed very unusual. In the early 1960s, most Americans weren't discussing organic vegetables or mindful breathing. The country was focused on economic growth, industry, and the steady rhythm of suburban life. Then along came a generation asking strange questions. Why were pesticides being sprayed so heavily on farms? Why did food come from factories instead of gardens? Why did daily life feel rushed, stressful, and disconnected from nature? Many of the answers weren't clear at the time, but the questions themselves sparked new conversations. You walk through a small farmer's market one morning and see the ripple effects everywhere. Tables stacked with fresh vegetables grown without chemicals, homemade bread, honey in glass jars. A young farmer proudly explaining how the tomatoes were grown using natural compost instead of synthetic fertilizers. Back in the late 1960s, ideas like this were often discussed by hippies living on communes, or experimenting with alternative farming techniques. Today, they've quietly entered the mainstream. Environmental awareness followed a similar path. The counterculture generation became deeply concerned about pollution, wildlife protection, and the health of the planet. Books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring helped ignite conversations about pesticides and environmental damage. Those conversations eventually led to major changes: environmental laws, national parks receiving stronger protections, and the creation of Earth Day in 1970, which grew directly out of the activism of the era. Meditation and Eastern philosophy also left their mark. Practices that once seemed exotic or mysterious, yoga, mindfulness, meditation, have now become part of everyday life for millions of people around the world. Back in the 1960s, these ideas were explored by small groups of curious seekers sitting cross-legged in parks or listening to spiritual teachers under eucalyptus trees. Now they appear in wellness programs, therapy offices, and even corporate boardrooms where stressed executives quietly attempt deep breathing exercises between meetings. The music survived too. Songs written during the counterculture era still drift through radios and playlists decades later. Guitar riffs from the late 1960s continue echoing through stadium concerts, coffee shops, and late-night road trips. Some of those songs were written by young musicians who had no idea their work would become part of cultural history. They were simply trying to express how the world felt at that moment. You sit on a park bench watching a group of college students nearby. They talk about climate change, social justice, and community activism with the same passion that once fueled marches during the Vietnam era. The hairstyles are different now, the clothing is less psychedelic, but the spirit of questioning authority, imagining alternatives and believing society can improve still feels familiar. Because movements rarely disappear completely. They transform. They scatter ideas into the future where new generations pick them up and reinterpret them in their own way. The hippie era may have been messy, chaotic, and occasionally naive, but it also planted seeds of environmental awareness, seeds of cultural openness, seeds of curiosity about how people might live more thoughtfully with each other and with the planet. You watch the students stand up and head off across the grass, still deep in conversation. The world around them looks very different from the muddy fields of Woodstock or the crowded streets of Haight-Ashbury. Yet somehow a small piece of that era is still here, quietly woven into the culture, like a guitar chord that keeps echoing long after the original song has ended. Looking back, the hippie revolution often appears either as a golden age of freedom or as a naive cultural fantasy. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. It was a time of genuine idealism mixed with confusion, hope tangled with chaos. You notice this most when people start telling stories about the era years later. Sit long enough in a quiet cafe, and someone will eventually lean back in their chair and begin a sentence with, "Back in the 60s, and suddenly the memories arrive." In one version of the story, the 1960s become a magical age of peace and creativity. Young people danced barefoot in sunny fields, music floated through the air, and an entire generation courageously rejected war, greed, and conformity. In that version, everyone is smiling, everyone is enlightened, and the biggest problem anyone faces is deciding which guitar song to play next. It's a lovely story. It's also slightly edited, because there is another version of the story. In that one, the hippie movement looks less like a peaceful revolution and more like a giant social experiment conducted by several 100,000 young people who were making things up as they went along. Communes struggled, money ran out, arguments happened. Sometimes the idealism of the movement collided directly with the complicated reality of human nature. You walk through a park one afternoon and overhear two older men talking on a bench. One of them smiles nostalgically. "It was the best time of my life," he says. "Music everywhere. Everyone believed we could change the world." The other laughs quietly. "Sure," he replies. "But half of us didn't know how to cook rice properly." Both statements, strangely enough, are true. The hippie era contained extraordinary creativity. New music, new art, new conversations about politics, civil rights, environmental protection, and personal freedom. But it also contained confusion. A lot of confusion. The movement asked enormous questions. How should society be organized? What does freedom really mean? Can people live peacefully without traditional structures of authority? These are not small questions. They are the kind philosophers have been debating for thousands of years. The hippies simply attempted to answer them all at once, while also organizing music festivals and occasionally forgetting to buy groceries. The result was unpredictable. Some communes became strong communities. Others quietly dissolved after a few difficult winters. Some experiments with spirituality opened meaningful conversations about meditation, mindfulness, and personal growth. Others led to misguided gurus and questionable advice about the cosmic wisdom of houseplants. The media often prefers simple stories. Either the hippies were heroes, or they were foolish dreamers, but history rarely fits neatly into those categories. Most people involved in the movement were neither saints nor fools. They were young, curious, sometimes reckless, often sincere, and very much human. You watch a group of teenagers walking through the park wearing headphones, their music spilling faintly into the air. Their clothes look different now. Their conversations revolve around modern problems. But the familiar spirit of questioning the world around them feels strangely familiar. Every generation eventually asks its own version of the same question. Could things be different? Back in the 1960s, a large group of young Americans decided to test that question as boldly as possible. The results were messy, occasionally brilliant, and sometimes deeply awkward. But when you step back and look at the full picture, the myth and the reality begin to blend together. Because the hippie revolution wasn't a perfect golden age, and it wasn't simply a naive fantasy either. It was something far more interesting. An entire generation experimenting, sometimes clumsily, sometimes courageously, with the idea that the world might be improved, even if they occasionally had to learn how to cook rice along the way. While the movement didn't overthrow capitalism or create a new society, it did reshape conversations about war, civil rights, gender roles, and personal freedom. Some dreams faded, but others quietly reshaped the culture for decades to come. You begin to notice the changes not in dramatic revolutions, but in quiet shifts. A conversation here, a law passed there, a cultural habit slowly fading while another one takes its place. History rarely changes all at once. It usually moves the way rivers do, gradually carving new paths over time. Back in the late 1960s, many people believed the counterculture might completely transform American society. Some imagined the collapse of traditional economic systems. Others hoped for a world organized around peace, communal living, and universal harmony. That version of the future never quite arrived. Banks did not disappear. Office buildings continued filling with workers every morning, and the concept of paying rent stubbornly refused to become optional. But something else did happen. The conversation changed. You see it first in the growing public debate about the Vietnam War. The anti-war protests that once seemed radical eventually helped shift public opinion across the country. By the early 1970s, increasing numbers of Americans questioned the conflict and demanded an end to the fighting. Political leaders could no longer ignore those voices. Then there were civil rights. While the struggle for racial equality had begun long before the hippie movement, the counterculture added energy to broader conversations about justice, fairness, and social responsibility. Many young activists began linking peace activism with civil rights and economic equality. The idea that citizens should question authority, once considered rebellious, gradually became part of mainstream political discussion. You notice another change in how people talk about personal freedom. Before the 1960s, many aspects of American life followed strict expectations. Careers were chosen carefully. Marriage followed predictable patterns. Public discussions about personal identity were often quiet, if they happened at all. The counterculture pushed against those boundaries. It encouraged people to ask uncomfortable questions. What kind of life do you actually want? Do social rules exist because they make sense, or simply because they have always existed? Those questions didn't disappear when the hippie era faded. They continued echoing through later movements for women's rights, LGBTQ equality, and broader conversations about individual identity. You see the influence even in something as simple as clothing. Once upon a time, strict dress codes defined workplaces, schools, and public spaces. Long hair on men was controversial. Casual clothing was rarely accepted outside the home. Today, most people walk into offices wearing clothes that would have caused mild panic in a boardroom 50 years earlier. It seems small. But cultural change often begins with small rebellions. The environmental movement also gained momentum during this era. Concerns about pollution, conservation, and protecting natural landscapes grew stronger as activists began drawing attention to the health of the planet. Those early conversations helped inspire environmental protections that remain in place decades later. You sit quietly in a park watching people pass by. A couple discusses climate change while walking their dog. A group of students nearby debate social justice issues between classes. Someone jogs past wearing headphones, listening to music that traces its roots back to the electric guitars of the late 1960s, the world doesn't look like the utopian dream many hippies once imagined. But it doesn't look exactly the same as it did before them either. Some revolutions arrive loudly with fireworks and dramatic declarations. Others arrive quietly, slipping into everyday life until people forget things were ever different. The counterculture of the 1960s never built a perfect new society, but it did something important. It made millions of people pause and reconsider the rules they had always accepted. And once a society begins asking those kinds of questions, the answers tend to echo for a very long time. By the mid-1970s, the psychedelic vans and flower crowns began fading into nostalgia. The hippie revolution didn't vanish overnight, but it slowly dissolved into everyday life. Some ideals survived, others quietly disappeared, and the generation that once promised to change the world discovered that changing the world is surprisingly complicated. You notice the change the way seasons change, not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually, almost politely. The parks that once filled with guitars every afternoon begin growing quieter. The crowds in Haight-Ashbury thin out. Some of the famous tie-dye shops close their doors or quietly transform into ordinary clothing stores. The bright swirl of the counterculture slowly softens into memory. You walk down a street that, a few years earlier, had been packed with wandering musicians, handmade posters, and people debating the meaning of life beside sidewalk cafes. Now it looks normal. Cars pass by. Office workers hurry toward lunch. A man in a neatly pressed shirt carries a briefcase past a record store, where an old poster for a Grateful Dead concert still hangs in the window. The world hasn't exactly rejected the counterculture, but it has moved on. By the mid-1970s, the social energy that once fueled massive gatherings and idealistic experiments begins settling into quieter forms. Many former hippies are now in their late 20s or early 30s, an age when alarm clocks, rent payments, and job interviews start appearing with surprising regularity. The psychedelic vans still exist, of course, but many of them are now parked behind apartment buildings instead of travelling from festival to festival. You see one sitting in a driveway, its once vibrant paint slightly faded by years of sunlight. Peace symbols and swirling colours still decorate the sides, though someone has carefully attached a small bumper sticker advertising a plumbing business. Times change. Inside nearby houses, the generation that once danced barefoot at Woodstock now prepares for ordinary evenings. Dinner is cooking, children are doing homework. A record player spins softly in the background, occasionally playing songs that once echoed across enormous festival crowds. The music remains. The lifestyle, however, evolves. For some people, the end of the flower power era feels disappointing. The bold dream of transforming society into a peaceful, communal paradise never quite materialized the way it had been imagined during long nights around campfires. Communes closed, movements fractured, and the complicated realities of politics, economics, and human nature proved far more stubborn than anyone had hoped. But not everything vanished. Pieces of the counterculture quietly blended into everyday life. The music never disappeared. The environmental awareness continued growing. Meditation, yoga, and holistic health practices slowly entered mainstream culture. Even the casual clothing once considered rebellious eventually became normal weekend attire. You pass a small park where a few teenagers sit on the grass listening to music from a portable radio. They laugh easily. They argue about ideas. They dream about the future in the same hopeful, uncertain way that young people always have. The details look different now. Different clothes, different music, different political conversations. But the spirit of questioning the world remains, because every generation eventually tries its own version of changing things, sometimes loudly, sometimes awkwardly, and sometimes with a van painted bright purple and orange. You pause for a moment and look back across the strange journey of the hippie era. The communes, the protests, the muddy fields of Woodstock, the long conversations about peace, freedom, and whether society could be rebuilt from scratch. It was chaotic, idealistic, occasionally ridiculous, but it was also sincere. An entire generation trying, sometimes clumsily, sometimes beautifully, to imagine a better world. The sun begins to set as the park grows quiet. Somewhere in the distance, someone strums a guitar. The notes drift gently through the evening air, and you realize something comforting about the end of the flower power era. The revolution may have faded, but the questions it asked are still echoing. Eventually you begin to notice something fascinating about this new counterculture society. Everyone has rejected money except when they really need it. Inside communes and city apartments, people trade goods and services in what they proudly call a gift economy. Someone offers guitar lessons in exchange for homemade bread. Another person promises spiritual counseling in return for a blanket. The system works beautifully until someone needs actual cash for rent, medical care or gasoline, at which point the harsh reality returns. Landlords, grocery stores, and hospitals remain stubbornly committed to the capitalist system. You first see the gift economy in action during a quiet afternoon at the Commune. A long wooden table sits outside beneath the shade of a large oak tree. On top of it rests a curious collection of items: a loaf of fresh bread, a knitted scarf, 3 jars of homemade jam, a stack of vinyl records, and something that might be herbal tea or might be dried leaves someone found in the garden. No price tags, just offerings. A handwritten sign nearby explains the idea. Take what you need, leave what you can. It sounds wonderfully simple, and in many ways it works surprisingly well, at least within small communities where people know each other and trust that everyone is contributing something useful. You watch the system unfold. One resident arrives carrying a basket of vegetables from the garden. They place the basket on the table and pick up a jar of honey someone else left earlier that morning. Another person sits nearby giving a guitar lesson to 2 beginners. Their payment arrives in the form of a loaf of sourdough bread and a promise that someone will help repair their bicycle later that week. Someone else offers to cook dinner tonight in exchange for help patching a hole in their cabin roof. The atmosphere feels cooperative, friendly, almost refreshingly simple compared to the complicated world of bills, paychecks, and bank accounts. For a moment it seems like the system might actually work, until someone needs gasoline. You hear about it during the evening meeting. A resident clears their throat while the group sits in their usual circle. So the van needs fuel, they explain, and the gas station does not accept philosophical conversations as payment. The group nods thoughtfully. Gasoline, unfortunately, is not impressed by the gift economy. The same problem appears in other areas too. Groceries from the outside world still cost money. Medical care costs money. Tools, repairs, building supplies, all of these stubbornly require the one thing the Commune originally hoped to avoid: cash. You begin noticing the quiet workarounds people invent. Some residents take part-time jobs in nearby towns, working a few days a week to bring in enough money to cover basic expenses. Others sell handmade crafts at markets or play music at local venues where someone eventually passes round a hat. The gift economy continues operating inside the community, but outside its borders the larger economy remains very much intact. You see the contrast clearly one afternoon when a small group visits a grocery store in town. Inside, everything has a price: bread, milk, apples. No one behind the register seems particularly interested in accepting meditation advice as payment for a bag of rice. One of the Commune members studies the receipt thoughtfully while leaving the store. Well, they say slowly, the universe still appears to prefer dollars. Back at the Commune that evening, dinner is served at the long table under the oak tree. Vegetable stew, fresh bread, and tea made from herbs gathered earlier that day. No money changes hands, just food shared between neighbours. The gift economy may not replace the entire financial system, but within the small circle of the commune it creates something valuable, a sense that resources can be shared, that people can help each other without always calculating profit. You sit quietly as the sun sets behind the trees. Someone plays a gentle guitar melody while the group finishes. Dinner. Tomorrow someone will need to drive into town to buy supplies with actual money, but tonight, at least for a few peaceful hours, everyone is perfectly happy trading bread for guitar lessons. At some point someone suggests hitting the road. After all, the whole country is full of open highways, music festivals, and mysterious communes where everyone is supposedly happier. Soon, you find yourself crammed into a brightly painted van decorated with peace symbols and cosmic swirls. Inside are 6 people, 2 guitars, a bag of questionable snacks, and a deep philosophical discussion about whether maps are oppressive tools of structured thinking. The road stretches ahead like a promise. Unfortunately, the van gets 8 miles per gallon, and nobody brought enough money for gas. You climb into the van anyway. Because if the 1960s counterculture believes in anything, it's the power of a spontaneous road trip. The interior of the vehicle looks like a mobile living room, designed by a group of enthusiastic artists who had very strong feelings about colour. Blankets cover the seats, beads hang from the rearview mirror. Someone has painted a small peace sign on the dashboard that seems to glow whenever sunlight hits it just right. The driver turns the key, the engine coughs, then coughs again. Eventually it roars to life with the dramatic enthusiasm of a machine that knows it is about to travel several hundred miles powered mostly by optimism. You pull onto the highway, open road ahead, wind blowing through the open windows, and immediately someone in the back begins playing guitar. Road trips during the hippie era become something of a cultural ritual. Young people pile into vans, buses, or whatever slightly functional vehicle happens to be available, and set off across the country searching for festivals, communes, music gatherings, or simply the feeling of freedom that comes from moving forward. No strict itinerary, no carefully planned reservations, just a vague idea that somewhere out there is the next great adventure. The guitars help. Music quickly fills the van, turning the cramped space into something resembling a travelling concert hall. Someone sings along loudly. Someone else taps the side of the door like a drum. The road stretches ahead through rolling hills and long straight highways that seem to disappear into the horizon. For a while it feels perfect. Freedom, after all, is easier to imagine when you're moving. Eventually someone asks an important question. How much gas do we have? The driver glances at the dashboard. The fuel gauge points toward a place that could generously be described as hopeful but uncertain. The van pulls into a gas station 30 minutes later. Everyone climbs out and gathers near the pump. The attendant watches with polite curiosity as 6 travellers examine their pockets. A few coins appear. Someone finds a crumpled dollar bill. Another person contributes a handful of change and what might be a guitar pick. You count everything carefully. The total would be impressive if you were attempting to buy a sandwich. Gasoline, however, is less flexible. The driver sighs. Well, we might need a strategy. Road trips during the hippie era frequently involve creative problem solving. Sometimes travellers play music outside gas stations while passing a hat. Other times they trade small crafts or offer rides to fellow wanderers willing to contribute fuel money. You watch as the group quickly forms a plan. 2 guitars come out. Someone begins strumming a cheerful folk melody beside the gas pump, while another member of the group sings with dramatic enthusiasm. The performance attracts a small audience of curious travellers. A few people toss coins into the open guitar case. Within 15 minutes you have enough money for a few gallons of gasoline. The van rolls back onto the highway, not with a full tank, but with enough momentum to continue the journey, miles past beneath the wheels. The scenery changes from cities to forests to wide open farmland where the sky stretches endlessly above the road. Inside the van, the conversation drifts between music, philosophy, and the eternal debate about where exactly everyone is going. Someone suggests Colorado. Someone else mentions a festival in New Mexico. A third person proposes simply following the road until something interesting happens. No one seems particularly concerned about the lack of a detailed plan, because for many people in the counterculture, the road itself is the destination. The idea that life might be less about arriving somewhere specific and more about experiencing the journey along the way. The van hums steadily as the sun begins setting in the distance. Guitars play softly again. And you realise something quietly amusing about the hippie road trip. It may not be the most efficient way to travel across America, but it is definitely the most colourful. Back in mainstream America, patience with the hippie movement is wearing thin. Parents worry their children have abandoned stability for a lifestyle built entirely around incense and vague optimism. Police departments grow increasingly suspicious of large gatherings filled with long-haired strangers. Politicians begin warning that the counterculture represents moral decline rather than social progress. What once felt like a peaceful revolution now exists under a growing cloud of criticism and confrontation. You feel the tension the moment you step back into a normal American town. The streets look familiar. Clean sidewalks, barbershops with striped poles, hardware stores displaying lawn tools in neat rows. But the reaction you receive is noticeably different from the relaxed curiosity of earlier years. A few people stare. One older woman pauses mid-step as she notices the long hair, the faded jeans, the necklace made of wooden beads. Her expression carries the quiet confusion of someone trying to understand how exactly the country reached this point. A man outside a diner mutters something under his breath that includes the word hippies and the general tone of disappointment. The cultural divide that once felt like a conversation now feels more like a standoff. For many parents across America, the hippie movement has become deeply unsettling. Families who expected their children to follow traditional paths, college, career, marriage, now watch as those same children drift toward communes, protests, and music festivals that appear to operate without adult supervision. Dinner table conversations grow tense. Parents ask practical questions. What are you going to do for work? How are you supporting yourself? Why does your friend keep bringing a tambourine to Thanksgiving? The answers rarely provide comfort, because explaining a philosophy of spiritual freedom to someone who survived the Great Depression can feel like describing cloud shapes to a very practical accountant. Meanwhile, police departments across the country begin paying closer attention to the growing gatherings of counterculture youth. Large crowds, loud music, and open displays of drug use create concerns for law enforcement officials tasked with maintaining order. Festivals, protests, and street gatherings increasingly attract police presence. Sometimes the interactions remain peaceful, other times they do not. You witness one such moment during a demonstration in a city square. The crowd begins with music and chanting, young voices calling for peace, civil rights, and social change. Signs wave gently in the afternoon breeze. Across the street, a line of police officers stands watching. At first, the distance between the two groups feels manageable, but tension lingers in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. All it takes is one shouted comment, one misunderstanding, one moment of frustration. Suddenly, the peaceful gathering begins shifting toward confrontation. It doesn't happen everywhere, of course. Many protests remain calm and organized, but the growing friction between the counterculture and mainstream institutions becomes impossible to ignore. Politicians begin speaking more openly about the movement. Campaign speeches warn about declining moral values, lawlessness, and a generation that appears determined to reject the traditions that built the country. Television news programs amplify the debate. On one channel, commentators describe the hippies as courageous voices for peace and social justice. On another, they are portrayed as irresponsible rebels undermining American stability. The country begins dividing itself into opinions, support, opposition, confusion. You walk through a city park where a small group of young people still gather with guitars and handmade signs. The music sounds the same, the ideals are still there. But the atmosphere feels different now, less innocent, more aware that the world is watching closely. A police car slowly drives past the park entrance. No one says anything. The guitar keeps playing, because even under criticism the movement continues doing what it has always done, singing songs, asking questions, and insisting, sometimes stubbornly, that the future could still be better than the present. Whether the rest of the country agrees is becoming a much louder conversation. By the early 1970s, many former hippies begin facing an unavoidable realization. Idealism alone does not pay the electric bill. Some quietly leave communes and return to cities. Others enroll in college programs they once rejected. The long hair might remain. The music certainly does, but the daily routine slowly shifts toward jobs, responsibilities, and something resembling adulthood. The revolution doesn't exactly end, it just gradually learns how to file taxes. You begin to see the change in small, practical moments. Not during the big gatherings or the late-night conversations about peace and consciousness. Those still happen. Guitars still appear around campfires. Someone still insists that society is on the brink of a profound spiritual awakening. But earlier the next morning someone has to wake up for work. At first, the adjustment feels strange. For years, the counterculture encouraged people to reject traditional routines. Alarm clocks were suspicious objects. Offices were symbols of conformity. Schedules were viewed as something designed primarily to interrupt philosophical discussions. Now suddenly, people are buying calendars. One former Commune resident moves into a small apartment in the city. The place looks modest but comfortable. There's a couch, a record player, and a bookshelf filled with dog-eared paperbacks about Eastern philosophy. There's also a desk, with paperwork, which feels like a significant cultural development. You visit one evening and find them sitting at the table examining a form with a look of deep concentration. "What's that?" you ask. They sigh slowly. "Taxes." The word hangs in the air like a particularly stubborn reality. Across the country, thousands of former hippies are experiencing the same moment. The grand experiment of dropping out has collided with the practical requirements of modern life. Rent, utilities, health care. The kind of everyday responsibilities that cannot be negotiated through interpretive guitar music. So people adapt. Some go back to school. Universities that once seemed like rigid institutions suddenly look a little more appealing when you realize they might lead to stable careers. Others find jobs in places that feel slightly more aligned with their values. Environmental organizations, community clinics, alternative bookstores where the dress code still allows a respectable amount of denim. Haircuts happen too. Not always dramatic ones. Often just small trims that make it easier to look presentable during job interviews, where the hiring manager may not fully appreciate a beard that resembles a small wildlife sanctuary. But the transformation isn't complete. Even as many former hippies step into adulthood, pieces of the counterculture remain woven into their lives. The music stays. Albums from the late 1960s still spin on turntables late at night. Songs that once echoed across festival fields now drift softly through apartment windows while someone finishes paperwork at the kitchen table. The ideals remain too. People who once marched in protests often carry that same sense of social awareness into their careers. Teachers bring lessons about peace and equality into classrooms. Journalists continue questioning authority. Environmental activists push for stronger protections for forests, rivers, and wildlife. The revolution, in a sense, simply changes form. Instead of giant gatherings in muddy fields, it appears in quieter places. City council meetings, community organizations, local campaigns to protect neighborhoods or improve schools. You walk past an office building one afternoon and notice something quietly amusing. Inside the lobby stands a man in a neatly pressed shirt speaking with a colleague about an environmental policy proposal. His hair is shorter now, but not short, just long enough to suggest that, at some point in the late 1960s, he probably attended at least one very muddy music festival. He finishes the conversation, steps outside, and climbs into a small car. On the back bumper is a faded sticker, a peace sign. The dream of the counterculture may not have replaced the entire system, but it clearly left fingerprints behind. You sit quietly on a park bench as the afternoon fades into evening. People hurry past carrying briefcases, grocery bags, and the 1,000 small responsibilities that come with ordinary life. Somewhere nearby, someone is playing a guitar. Soft, familiar. And you realize something comforting about the way the hippie revolution eventually met real life. It didn't completely disappear. It just learned how to exist between staff meetings and tax forms. And perhaps the strangest twist of all is what happens decades later. Many of the young rebels who once rejected the system eventually become part of it. Some build successful careers, businesses, and comfortable suburban lives. They raise families, attend community meetings, and occasionally reminisce about the days when they lived in a van and debated the meaning of the universe. The hippie revolution didn't destroy American society. In a curious way, it simply blended into it. You see the irony most clearly many years later. It's a quiet Saturday morning in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. Lawns are trimmed neatly, mailboxes stand at the end of long driveways. Someone down the street is washing a car while a radio plays softly from an open garage. The song drifting through the air sounds familiar, very familiar. A guitar riff from the late 1960s fills the neighborhood, the same music that once echoed through muddy festival, fields and crowded city parks. Only now it's playing next to a row of recycling bins and a minivan. You walk past one house where a man in his 60s stands in the driveway holding a coffee mug. His hair is grey now, but you notice something interesting. It's still a little long, not dramatically rebellious, just longer than the average banker might prefer. He glances at the radio and smiles. "That song takes me back," he says to a neighbour walking by. The neighbour laughs. "Woodstock?" they ask. He nods. Woodstock. For many members of the hippie generation, the decades that followed the counterculture era unfolded in ways that would have seemed almost impossible back in 1967. The young people who once rejected corporate jobs eventually became business owners, professors, engineers, and managers. Some entered politics. Others built careers in technology, education, or medicine. The system they once protested slowly absorbed them, or perhaps they absorbed parts of it. Either way, the result is fascinating. You step into a local grocery store and notice organic vegetables stacked neatly in the produce section. Labels proudly advertise natural farming methods and environmentally friendly packaging. A small sign reads, "Locally grown." Back in the 1960s, ideas like organic farming were mostly discussed by small groups of counterculture gardeners experimenting with new ways of living closer to the land. Now those same ideas are part of a billion-dollar industry. The blending continues everywhere. Meditation classes appear in community centres. Yoga studios open in suburban shopping plazas. environmental organizations grow stronger as public awareness about conservation spreads. Even corporate offices quietly adopt ideas that once belonged to the counterculture: casual dress codes, flexible schedules, workplace discussions about mental health and balance. The revolution didn't overthrow society, but society clearly borrowed some of its ideas. You attend a neighborhood barbecue one evening where several older residents gather around a picnic table sharing stories. One man describes traveling across the country in a van during the early 1970s. Another remembers living in a commune for a year before eventually returning to college. Someone else admits they once hitchhiked across 3 states to attend a music festival because they heard a band was going to play all night. The stories drift through the warm evening air like memories from another lifetime. Children run across the yard chasing each other while their parents laugh and refill paper cups with lemonade. The scene feels comfortable, stable, a long way from the muddy chaos of Woodstock. Yet if you listen closely to the stories being told around the table, you realize something quietly remarkable. Many of these people never completely abandoned the spirit of their younger years. They simply carried pieces of it forward. A little skepticism about authority, a belief that community should help one another, a quiet conviction that the world can always be improved, even if the improvement arrives slowly. The hippie revolution never became the sweeping transformation some people imagined, but it didn't vanish either. Instead, it seeped into everyday life like a gentle cultural tide. You walk home as the sun begins to set across the quiet neighborhood. The music from the garage radio fades into the distance, and you realize the strangest part of the entire story. The generation that once tried to escape society eventually helped reshape it, not by tearing it down, but by slowly, quietly, repainting parts of it with brighter colors. And just like that, your long, strange day in the 1960s counterculture finally comes to an end. You woke up in a crowded apartment that smelled like incense and questionable life decisions. You wandered through the colourful streets of Haight-Ashbury, tried to understand the philosophy of dropping out, survived communal cooking that tasted suspiciously like boiled leaves, and listened to guitar solos that lasted longer than some modern marriages. Along the way you saw the hope, the rebellion, the chaos, and the strange contradictions of a generation trying very hard to reinvent the world. Some of them truly believed peace and love could reshape society. Some were searching for freedom from a system that felt rigid and exhausting. Others simply wanted a place where they could belong. And like most moments in history, the truth turned out to be complicated. The hippie revolution didn't destroy America, and it didn't create a perfect utopia either. Instead, it left behind pieces of itself scattered through culture: environmentalism, meditation, music festivals, organic food, and the persistent belief that maybe life should involve a little less stress and a little more meaning. But tonight, as you lie in a clean bed with indoor plumbing, reliable electricity, and a refrigerator that does not require philosophical debate to open, you might feel quietly grateful for the comforts of modern life. Because history has a funny way of reminding us that every generation is a little confused, a little hopeful, and occasionally a little ridiculous. And that's probably a good thing. After all, those flower-wearing dreamers help shape the world we live in now, even if they occasionally forgot to wash their dishes. So settle deeper into your pillow, let your thoughts drift, and allow the noise of the day to fade away. History may be strange, messy, and sometimes absurd, but it's also proof that people, in every era, are stubborn enough to keep trying to build something better. And tonight, you can finally get some rest.